Hello everyone. Today we're going to learn some basic watercolor techniques. There's two videos in today's series. The first, we're going to learn some basic washes that will get you started with watercolor painting. And in video number 2, we will learn some basic color mixing techniques, 3 different styles. One is mixing in your palette, and the other 2 involve mixing the color right on the page, which can sometimes create some really dynamic color. So get ready and let's get painting. Hello everyone, we're working on watercolor techniques today, and you can see I've taken my our board and I've taped a piece of watercolor paper from our kit onto the front of it. I'm using the slightly smoother side of the paper, and I've drawn 4 boxes using my straight edge onto my board. And the reason you want to tape it on, I haven't done a great job. I haven't gone all the way around the edges. I just want to keep it from buckling up just a little bit, as we start to add water to it. Some papers are going to be a little bit better about dealing with the amount of water that you use. This paper is a wood pulp paper. The very best watercolor papers are made with 100% cotton. Which means they deal with the water better. They don't dry out quite as fast. So on this kind of paper, which is a little less expensive, certainly more affordable for us to use, will dry a little bit faster. So we kind of have to be aware of that as we're working on our layering, that the paint's going to dry a little bit faster. We have a little bit less working time. So I'm going to prop mine up. The reason why we want to put it on this this piece of plastic board here is so that we can kind of elevate our work a little bit and get it at a little bit of an angle. That'll help the paint kind of move down the page. So I'm gonna, if there's a book. I'm gonna just put a book there, a little light reading. So now I'm ready, and the first technique we're going to learn how to do is called a flat wash. And so I'm going to use the larger of the brushes in our kit. This has got an angle to it, but it'll also work really well, as we pull the paint across. So it works as a flat brush, and it can kind of work as an angled shader brush as well. So I'm going to go into my water here. Right now I'm going to be using the phthalo blue color. So I'm going to mix up a paint consistency that is not too thin, not too heavy bodied. With water, don't be afraid to use enough water. But again, we don't want to use too much water so that, it dilutes all of the pigment. It really is kind of a dance that you do, and the more you do it, you'll learn to what paint consistency is all about. So you can kind of see what my consistency of my paint is like right there. And you can see I have dry paper, and so now I'm going to do my best to paint. I'm going to go maybe just a little bit more water. I want to make sure that paint really flows, and that I have enough paint to be able to paint my whole square. So that's kind of like cooks get all of their ingredients chopped up and ready to go before they start cooking, because it goes kind of fast and furious. Watercolor painting is very similar to that. We want to get everything ready to go before we start. So you want to make sure you have enough color to cover the page. So I'm going to start, and I'm just going to drag my brush across until I reach the edge, and I'm going to lift up just a little bit. You see I have a little bit of a bead there. See I have a little bead of paint at the bottom edge. I'm going to overlap that by just a little bit, and I have sort of lifted my board up just a little bit higher. Can you see how I've got that bead of paint is underneath? It's sort of at the bottom of kind of down here along the bottom, and we've got a little bit of paint on that edge. That's exactly what I'm counting on. That's what I'm hoping for. And that's why we want to elevate our page to be kind of at an angle, so that we can work with that bead to our advantage. But you see how that paint is. I'm going to kind of go back over that just a little bit. I want to kind of work with that last paint stroke there. Because the goal with a flat wash is to get again, as flat a wash of color as we can. So I'm lifting my page up even a little bit more, kind of moving that bead down to the bottom edge so that I can really control it as I move across. But you see how that paint, it really wants to roll down, and it wants to go, exactly where I'm telling it to. And again, I'm lifting up at the end. Flat washes are great for skies. If you're doing, if you're painting a building or something, big areas of flat color, water. If you're starting to do that, you can see I'm already starting to dry up here at the top of the page. So this particular paper, it dries pretty fast. So you want to work with it, pretty fast as you go. Okay, so we're gonna let that one dry. I'm going back into my cobalt blue again. We're just gonna work with that this whole time. I'm mixing up a little more of that color. And again, we are also going to be working on dry paper with wet paint. And we're going to start by doing exactly the same thing that we did before. I'm going to pull a bead of that paint across. And I'm going to go back in my paint just a little bit and overlap that stroke by just a little bit, maybe about half. I'm overlapping that stroke. Now I'm going to go into my water, load up a little bit of water into my brush, and I'm going back into that paint, and I'm thinning that mixture out just a little bit. So now I've thinned out the mix so I don't have quite as much pigment in the paint as I had before. And you can move back and forth if you want to, as long as the paint is still wet as you try to work to smooth it out. But don't rework too much because if the paint starts to dry on your page, you will eventually start to lift that, where it has dried, you will start to lift that paper, lift the paint back up. So I went into my paint instead of going back into my color that's in my tray, and I'm just pulling that thinned version of the paint down the page so we can create what's known as a graded wash. So I'm going back into water, I'm not going back into my paint, and I'm getting a little bit of that water out of my paintbrush so I don't have a tremendous amount of paint anymore. And you see the goal with this, I'm just sort of dabbing off there, maybe a little bit of water to be able to pull that down. The goal with this is to be able to get a gradient or a graded wash as it moves down your square there. And you see, I think we were fairly successful with that. It's starting to dry there a little bit, and I'm reticent to go back in and try to rework that, even though I could probably smooth out that color. What I can do is dip back into the water, get rid of some of that water out of my brush, since this is all still quite wet, and I can lift up some of that color that I have left on the page and sort of dab it off on my paper towel or whatever it is that you have. Always work with a piece of paper towel, or I've got some old t-shirts here, or an old sponge or something like that will allow you to be able to lift up some of that paint there at the end if you've got a little bit too much. And again, now I'm starting to rework, and when you rework, that's when you cry. Well, that's when I cry. Okay, so you see how I'm starting to make it look streaky in there? That means you should stop reworking it, Sean. Okay, so I'm going to clean my brush off. I have two containers of water. You might only be using one, but I generally use two so that I can keep one relatively clean water. This next technique we're going to do is called wet into wet, which means we want to go into clean water. And you see I've got a little bit of that cobalt or phthalo are similar colors. I'm going to get some of that water. I'm going to take out just a little bit of it, and I'm going to paint this square with that clear water. And so when we start applying our color to this, we already have a wet surface, and you'll see that the paint will only want to go where there is already water. And you'll see that the water allows I had a little bit of, I went into my other paint bucket there, so I had a little bit of color in there. So you'll see that the water will allow the paint to sort of run down the page. I'm going to set my brush down. So you may not be able to see it in the video, but whenever you you work on your own, you'll be able to pick up your page, pick up the board, and you can sort of see when you first put the water down, it'll be really glossy and very wet. Your goal is to get an even coverage of water. As you let it dry for maybe, I don't know, 15, 20, 30 seconds, you'll start to see that some of the gloss is going away. We want to go from a very wet stage to more of a damp stage, and that's when we can then come in and apply our color. So I'm going to get some strong color here that I'm mixing up, and on my wet page I'm going to charge in with this color, and you can see that we've let it dry just a little bit, but you see that paint start to run down the page in a way that it did not when we worked straight into dry. This is called capillary action, and the paint is sort of, the water is the vehicle, but the paint is moving down the page using the action, capillary action, and part of it has to do with the way it works with the type of paper that it is. I don't know what that is that I've got on my page, but I don't know what it is, but I don't want it. All right, so I'm going to get rid of that. But you can see that that paint really wants to run down the page in a way that we were not able to get it to go last time. Depending upon the kind of paper you have, you could make maybe 2 strokes and it'll drift all the way down the page. This wood pulp paper is not quite as good at that. This paper is really great for detail work. So that'll be something when we start, kind of doing details. You'll appreciate the the way this paper sort of works with that. It's more like the 2 types of paper that we typically use are called cold press and hot press. Cold press paper has a texture to it, and it has to do with the way they manufacture the paper. Hot press is smoother, so you can see there's a little bit of a grain, a little bit of a texture to this paper. So it's kind of in between a hot press and a cold press paper. Okay, I'm going to put my board down, and once again I'm going to go back into my my phthalo blue or cobalt blue color, and this time I'm going back onto dry paper again. See what a nice soft, kind of until we got down here, what a nice soft transition I got with that. This kind of paper, if it's still, I'm stepping away for just a second to grab a, do I have a paper towel? I'll be right back. When you're working wet into wet and the paper is still slightly damp, you can take a crumpled up paper towel or tissue, and you can kind of blot into the paper, and you can make some really nice effects. You see it's too dry on the top because it's already started to dry, but look, I could make some nice clouds there using that. Dry it off a little bit. Maybe I have a little bit of this alizarin crimson. Maybe I want to come in on that bottom edge and paint in a little bit of that red. I might get a little sense of the fluffiness of those clouds. So you could, when you're working wet into wet, you often do some interesting techniques like that. So I'm cleaning out my brush again, get rid of that the red. I'm going back into my phthalo blue. And this time I'm sort of going to use kind of all the surfaces of my brush to kind of give myself a little bit of kind of a scumbly sort of a texture. Actually, when you're scene painting, we call this a scumble. And I'm going to go back in there with some more of the same paint that I mixed up. You see it's kind of running downhill because I've got my paper, my board tilted. If you decide, there are times when you want your work to dry flat. Once you have, worked on a wash, Often you might want to take your book away, lay your work flat, and allow it to dry, and that way the paint won't entirely pool, down at the bottom edge of the page. We can also come in. Do you see the tip of my brush there? I'm going to go right into the color. I'm not going back into that the looser mix that I made, but this is a stronger version of the color. And you see, I can put some really strong color in there, and how, because of the way the water is already on the page, it's going to allow that strong color to kind of work into that little bit of lighter color. You also have an opportunity, I'm going to get a little bit of water. I've got a little bit more paint. You can also you can do little spatters. You see that some of those little capillary type stuff that we did right there in the middle. I could even take, without any paint, I could come in and just with water. You see the big droplets that I get there? So that could dry into a really interesting texture for us, where we've got strong kind of heavy color. I came right out of the paint pan, and so that would be the sort of the thickest version, or the most paint, the most pigment, robust, full-bodied paint that I have. And you see how that's drying out, and as the paint starts to dry, some of those interesting textures are going to dry into it. So I find this really interesting. Sometimes skies are, maybe better, like this. Or perhaps you're trying to paint a gradient. You want to go from, of course, I likely would not spatter, an entire thing like this if I had other things going on. But it is interesting, and I often find that if my something I'm painting wants a little bit of life, or it wants a little jolt of something, I might find a complementary color of what it is that I'm working on, and maybe just kind of tap that in there a little bit. What I may do, gosh, I don't know. Here's this our warmer version of the red is a little bit it's a little bit orange. So maybe I get a little bit of a watery version of that, and maybe tap that in a little bit, and then you'll see, because that paint was already drying, you're going to get these things they're going to kind of bloom out. You see where my paper was dry? Those dots stayed pretty much the size they were when they fell. Where I fell onto wet paint that had already gone from the wet stage to sort of the damp stage, we're starting to get these blooms. The color is starting to spread out and diffuse a little bit, so you'll get nice soft edges. And one of the things that we'll work on as we continue to work on our watercolor painting are the idea of hard edges versus soft edges in the watercolor work that we do. That will help you push things into the distance if you're painting landscapes or atmospheric perspective in some of the paintings that you make. Soft and fuzzy and slightly cooler in color pushes things into the background. So this could be a lovely kind of a night sky, or a star field, or some sort of constellation. You can use your imagination, and one of the things about watercolor, because it is not entirely precise or specific all the time, your audience can use their imagination a lot, and so you don't have to fill in all of the details, which again is something we do in the theater as well when we're designing something for the stage. Your audience is an active part. They're a participant. They're one of your collaborators in what it is that the final thing that gets put on the stage. So allow your audience to be an active collaborator with you, and don't give them all the answers. And that's one of the ways you can make your work even more interesting.